10 days after a magnitude 7.4 earthquake tore through western Colombia, the number of people still listed as missing has climbed to 320, even though officials publicly declared the search's critical phase over more than a week ago. If that sounds contradictory, a missing persons count rising or holding steady well after the official search window has technically closed, it is not, and understanding why reveals something important about how a disaster of this size actually gets counted, not just survived. This is the story of what has actually happened in Colombia since the earthquake struck on August 10th, why rescue and recovery work is still genuinely ongoing more than a week after the headlines moved on, and what the specific, honest reasons are behind a missing persons figure that has proven so difficult to pin down precisely. No exaggeration, just what Colombia's National Unit for Disaster Risk Management, the United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, and journalists who have been on the ground throughout this disaster are actually reporting. Drop a comment and tell me if you have been following this story since the earthquake first struck, because the version of this disaster still unfolding today looks considerably different from what most people saw in the first viral headlines 10 days ago, and it deserves a second look now that the initial shock has faded. I read every one of these. If you want grounded coverage instead of recycled panic, subscribe. It is free, and a like helps this reach people who deserve an accurate current picture rather than outdated numbers. Let us go for 5,000 likes on this one. Now let us get into it. To understand why this recovery effort has stretched on this long, you first need to understand the sheer scale of what the earthquake actually destroyed. The magnitude 7.4 quake struck early on August 10th, centered near San Jose del Palmar in Colombia's remote Choco department, a community of roughly 4,800 people about 250 miles west of Bogota. It was the strongest earthquake to hit Colombia this century, and within days, officials confirm more than 170 buildings had collapsed, alongside more than 12,000 homes destroyed or damaged. The damage extended far beyond housing alone. A pedestrian bridge collapsed entirely, 20 road bridges were affected, more than 200 roads sustained damage, 5 airports were forced to suspend operations, and 44 aqueducts serving local water supplies were damaged, according to figures President Abelardo de la Espriella, who had taken office just days before the earthquake struck, laid out directly to the public. That combination, a remote epicenter with historically limited road access even before the quake, layered on top of that scale of infrastructure damage, is the foundational reason this recovery has taken considerably longer than a more accessible disaster zone would have, since crews and equipment often cannot simply drive directly to the areas that need them most, and repairing or bypassing damaged roads and bridges has to happen before full access is even possible in some of the hardest hit communities. The death toll climbs steadily and at times dramatically throughout the first week. Early reports on the day of the earthquake confirmed around 20 deaths, a number that climbed past 100 by that same evening, then past 200 within 2 days, and continued rising through the following week as rescue crews reached additional collapsed sites. By August 13th, as officials marked the end of the critical 72-hour survival window, widely considered the point after which finding additional survivors became increasingly unlikely, the confirmed death toll stood at 281 with more than 3,800 people injured. Officials in Cali and Pereira, 2 of the hardest hit cities, publicly described their search efforts as entering a final phase around that same point, shifting resources in many locations from active search and rescue toward debris removal, a grim but standard transition in disaster response once the statistical odds of finding survivors alive beneath rubble drop close to zero. Here is where the story becomes genuinely more complicated than a simple countdown of confirmed deaths, and it centers specifically on how differently the missing persons count has been tracked. In the days immediately following the earthquake, Colombia's own National Unit for Disaster Risk Management reported the missing count at around 500 people, a figure that had eased slightly to roughly 400 by the time the 72-hour window closed. At the exact same moment, separate civilian-run tracking databases, built largely from individual families reporting missing loved ones directly rather than through official government channels, put the missing figure considerably higher, over 4,100 people at one point. That gap between the official count and the civilian tracked count is not a sign either side is being dishonest. It reflects a genuinely difficult reconciliation problem in any disaster this size, cross-referencing family-reported names against hospital admissions, shelter registration lists, and eventually recovered remains. Takes real time and duplicate reports, people who evacuated without formally checking in anywhere, and simple communication breakdowns in the hardest hit. Most remote areas all inflate the earliest raw tallies well beyond what a more careful, methodical count eventually settles on. That reconciliation process is precisely why a missing persons figure like the current 320 can continue shifting, and even decline meaningfully, well after active search and rescue has formally wound down. Every name on a missing persons list has to be resolved one of three ways, matched to a recovered body, often requiring forensics. Identification methods like DNA analysis when remains are too damaged for visual identification, confirmed alive through hospital records, shelter registrations, or direct family contact, or in cases where neither outcome can be established, eventually formally reclassified through a legal process that varies by jurisdiction but is never instantaneous. That administrative work continues for weeks or even months after the physical search for survivors has ended, which is exactly why a missing persons count moving well past the point, news coverage typically drops. A disaster does not indicate rescue crews gave up. It indicates the harder, slower, considerably less photogenic work of actually resolving every individual case is still genuinely underway, work that rarely produces a dramatic headline of its own, even though it matters enormously to every single family still waiting for a definitive answer. There is also a real, documented complication specific to this disaster's early response that is worth understanding honestly. As international aid began arriving in the days after the earthquake, Colombia's government announced it would only accept rescue teams from 4 specific countries, a decision that drew public criticism from analysts studying the response. Political scientist Sandra Borda specifically linked the resulting difficulties to Colombia's tense political transition, noting the new administration appeared to show a deep distrust of parts of the international community that she considered difficult to understand, and pointing out there was no clear public procedure explaining how international personnel were actually being allocated to the areas that needed the most. That friction in the earliest, most critical days of the response, when speed genuinely matters most for finding survivors, is a real, documented factor in this disaster's timeline, separate from and in addition to the underlying access challenges posed by Chaco's remote geography. It is worth holding on to a genuinely hopeful detail from this disaster's early days as well, because it illustrates why search efforts continued as long as they did before officially winding down. In Pereira, rescue crews worked a complex 12-hour extraction to free Daniela Largo from the rubble of a collapsed building, carving a small opening to reach her pinned arm and stabilizing her with IV fluids mid-rescue before finally pulling her out alive, more than a full day after the earthquake initially struck. Rescues like hers, arriving well beyond the time frame many people assume survival becomes impossible, are precisely why disaster response teams continue active search efforts for as long as they responsibly can before transitioning to recovery, even knowing that each additional day meaningfully lowers the odds of finding anyone else alive. So what does all of this actually mean if you have been following this story or have any connection to the affected region yourself? The practical lesson is that a missing persons count is a fundamentally different, slower-moving number than a confirmed death toll, and treating its persistence or gradual decline as evidence that recovery work has stalled misunderstands what that number is actually measuring. If you have family or friends anywhere in the affected departments, particularly the more remote areas of Chaco, understanding that formal reconciliation of missing persons lists genuinely continues for weeks after the active search phase ends is a more accurate way to think about ongoing uncertainty than assuming any lack of new information means the worst has already been confirmed, since silence in this specific process often reflects careful, methodical work rather than bad news being deliberately withheld. The honest, grounded summary is this. 10 days after Colombia's magnitude 7.4 earthquake, the missing persons count stands at 320, even though officials declared the critical search phase over more than a week ago, a gap explained by the genuinely slow, methodical work of reconciling family-reported names, hospital records, and recovered remains, rather than any indication that recovery efforts have stopped. Colombia's early decision to restrict international rescue assistance to only 4 countries drew real criticism and likely complicated the response during its most time-sensitive early days, layered on top of the genuine access challenges posed by the remote mountainous terrain surrounding the earthquake's epicenter in Choco department. The confirmed death toll climbed past 280 during the critical first week, and while search and rescue has formally transitioned toward recovery and reconciliation in most affected areas, the work of accounting for every single person reported missing remains genuinely unfinished. We are going to keep tracking this recovery the way we tracked it today, straight from Colombia's National Unit for Disaster Risk Management, the United Nations, and journalists still reporting from the affected region, not recycled headlines. Subscribe so you do not miss it as this missing persons count continues to resolve in the weeks ahead. Because based on how this process has unfolded so far, that number is very likely to keep shifting before it settles for good, and it deserves continued attention long after most outlets have quietly moved on to the next story. And leave that comment below. Tell me if learning how long this kind of reconciliation process genuinely takes changes how you read missing persons, figures in future disasters. Because that patience is exactly what families in Colombia are being asked to hold on to right now, week after week, with no guarantee of when their own answer will finally come. Because behind every one of these 320 open cases is a family in Chaco or Pereira, checking a list that updates slower than they can bear. A forensic investigator painstakingly working through DNA samples that take real time to process correctly, a translator or aid worker helping a rural family navigate a bureaucratic reconciliation process most of them have never had to face before, and a rescue worker who pulled someone out alive on day 2, now doing considerably harder. Quieter work on day 10, the kind that never makes the headlines, but genuinely determines how this story actually ends for hundreds of families still waiting. 5,000 likes on this one. Let us go. See you in the next one.